Welcome to the Learn, Think, Build podcast. This is episode 2. I'm Josh O'Brien, your host, and I don't have a guest with me today, but Brandon Ford, our producer, is here, so if we need some other insight thrown in, he's here. Episode 1 was titled The Virus and the Great Reset. I thought it was a very important topic to cover, and today is part 2 of that same topic. We're going to start discussing the lockdowns here, the response that our government has made to the virus. And let's talk about the side effects of these lockdowns. Everyone is aware that a lot of our businesses, our small businesses, are taking a big hit from these lockdowns. And in addition to the businesses, we've had a lot of mental health side effects. We've had a lot of physical health side effects. We've had increased domestic abuse, strained relationships. In addition to that, there's a lot of medical necessities that are not being addressed because people are not making it to these medical facilities out of fear and also out of limited access to these things as well. The virus has really wreaked havoc on us, not only in terms of health, but in these other aspects. And we're going to be discussing this today because I think it's very important. I'm going to give you a quote by Dr. Michael Dubois-Blanc. He was the former trauma medical director at John Muir Health in California. And this is what he said about the lockdowns, specifically closing schools, banning indoor dining. He said, public policy is being based on erroneous assumptions. That is, the science is clear that more lockdowns lead to much more non-COVID morbidity and mortality. Morbidity, we know, is sickness, and of course, mortality is death. And what he's saying here is that we've got additional sickness and death from non-COVID sources because of the lockdowns that we've decided is the best way to approach managing the risk from the virus. And after he said that, he was quickly fired from his job because, of course, we know in this country that our government has pushed these lockdowns and they're not really considering an alternative. Makes us question why. I want to do a quick review of the content that we covered from episode 1. In episode 1, we discussed this New York Times article that came out in August, and it was titled, "Your Coronavirus Test is Positive, Maybe It Shouldn't Be." Very illuminating article. And I'm going to review some of that information here because it's going to help us maybe give some insight into what's happening today. So we've been using these PCR tests. The PCR tests, we've been told, is the gold standard for measuring the amount of virus that's within an individual. The amount of virus tells us how much at risk the individual is in terms of getting sick themselves, and also how much of a risk they pose in terms of communicating that to other people. Now, the PCR tests that we've been using can be calibrated to a very specific level of sensitivity. And the levels that they've been calibrated to, as discussed in this New York Times article, has been to what they call level 40 or level 37. That's the number of cycles of measurement that the device goes through in its functioning of analyzing the sample from the individual and then telling us if the individual is either positive or negative for COVID-19. Now, in this article that I mentioned last time, and I'm going to review today, these tests have been calibrated to be overly sensitive, and that was stated by a number of physicians in the article. Now, Dr. Michael Mina, he's an epidemiologist at Harvard University. Epidemiology is the study of disease. In fact, disease that spreads through populations and, in fact, the world. Bit of an expert. Harvard. He's also an engineer, very bright guy. And he's been pretty outspoken through this process of going through the lockdowns and managing the disease. It's his specialty. He's been very active in working with local governments, California state government, city of Los Angeles. And what he's been saying is that the test sensitivity that we've set is too high. It's giving us a lot of false positives. And here, I don't want to spend too much time on this. Again, this is a review of what we did last time. He said that, this is a quote, he's referring to the high level of sensitivity that we set these tests to, and that when someone produces a positive test, we're really not considering what level of sensitivity the test was set to. And what he says here is that it's really irresponsible, I think, to forego the recognition that this is a quantitative issue. This is not binary. It's not yes, no. We need to know how much viral component, how much of the virus is in this individual, because it may be benign, and therefore the response is unwarranted. And the harmful side effects of the lockdowns are not worth keeping this person out of the population because they're actually not really sick, not in terms of communicating the disease to others or experiencing it themselves. And this is relevant. In addition to Dr. Michael Minnen, we've got Dr. Juliet Morrison in the same New York Times article. She says the same thing. She said, I'm shocked that people would think that 40 could represent a positive, meaning when they're calibrating these tests and they're setting the sensitivity to 40 cycles of measurement, what that means is, in terms of practical consideration, the test is 100 to 1,000 times more sensitive than it should be. Again, I'm quoting this article and these physicians. Dr. Minna himself said that he would set the test sensitivity to either 30 or even less. So we're seeing that these are too sensitive. Scott Becker, executive director of the Association of Public Health Laboratories, said that the number of people with positive results who aren't infectious is particularly concerning. That worries me a lot just because it's so high. And he's worried because these individuals are testing positive. They're being pulled out of the population, told to quarantine. And our concern about these individuals is what is making us go through with these lockdowns that are really hurting us in so many ways. And he's saying this is really concerning because it seems we're over-responding, we're overreacting to this. Now, the New York State lab, and again, this article was published in August. The New York State lab went back to 872 positive tests that they had received in the month of July from 3 different states. And what they did was, because those tests had been set to level 40, which Dr. Minna and these other 2 physicians are saying is too high, this is causing a lot of false negatives. The New York Times actually commissioned this lab to go back and analyze these samples that had tested positive, 872 of them in the month of July. And what they did was they actually retested these positive samples at a level of sensitivity that these doctors said the test should be set to, 30, 35. This is what they found. With a cutoff of 35, about 43% of those tests are no longer positive. At level 30, which is what Dr. Minna recommends, or even less, 63% are negative. That's a huge difference. The article concludes with, in Massachusetts, between 85 and 90% of people who tested positive in July at number 40 would not be positive at number 30. Dr. Minna followed up and said, I would say that none of these people should be contact traced, not one. I'm concerned about this because it looks like our government and the policies that they've set have led us to believe that we have more sick people in our population than we do, and they pose more of a risk to the rest of us than they really do. Now,
and these people that were normally respected are now considered anathema and sort of run out of town, so to speak.
Well, that's
just for suggesting this, not even just voicing their professional opinion.
Yeah, there's been sort of a purging of voices that have anything to say against these policies, and they're sort of demonized. We're told that these people are crazy or they're irresponsible for seemingly reducing what we think should be high alarm to this disease. They're really telling us that the risk is not as high as we're being told it is, and we're told they're irresponsible. And let's see today if we really think that that's true. Now, in addition to the health part of this whole pandemic and the lockdowns, there's a legal part. And what happened was some people were not happy and brought lawsuits against their state governments for mandating these lockdowns, the shutdown of businesses, and so on, right? Because it's killing a tremendous amount of small businesses. It's killing different sectors of the economy and also those that are self-employed. And a lot of people are suffering. So these lawsuits were brought. And on September 14th, this is from the Associated Press, the Pennsylvania lockdowns and restrictions on home gatherings were ruled unconstitutional in federal court. In addition to that, this is from the New York Post. In October, the Michigan State Supreme Court ruled that the governor had, quote, overstepped her authority by repeatedly issuing emergency COVID-19 declarations without ever getting the approval of the state lawmakers. So we see that in these two cases that went to court and were ruled on by a judge, that the judge actually ruled in favor of those that said these lockdown measures are actually not legal. Your governor is not allowed to do this. The governor has overstepped her bounds, his bounds, and so on. And in fact, they're wrong to do so. Now, that's one of the beautiful things about this country. That's what makes this country what it is we've got this Constitution that guarantees our rights. And although we can make the argument that the intentions are coming from the best place from these governors, the fact is they don't have the right to do it. And that's been ruled on. Moving on. I want to bring something up here that's interesting. Now, this is a study that came out of Cambridge University in England. This is a very prominent university, and any research coming out of there is going to be looked at. They're good researchers, and they put out good information, not easily dismissed. And the title of this study was BioVac 19, a candidate vaccine for COVID-19 developed from analysis of its general method of action for infectivity, if you want to look it up. This is by Sorensen et al. Now, when describing the virus's method of infection, all right, this is on page 3, the way the virus infects people is with a particular protein, and this is what the paper said, direct quote, "It is a matter of fact that there are unique inserts in the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein when they are aligned with other SARS-CoV sequences." What this is saying is that when we look at SARS-CoV viruses and COVID-19, we see that COVID-19 has a spike protein that's been added to it. And what the researchers concluded here was that it's a unique insert and that it's actually what we call a gain of function feature of this virus. Now, gain of function is a euphemism in biological research, and it describes a characteristic of the virus that's aimed at increasing the virulence, and the lethality, how deadly these pathogens and viruses are. So essentially what we're saying here is that COVID-19 has had a human addition in the form of a protein, what we call a spike protein, added to a previously existing virus. It means that this virus was modified in a laboratory. It had a spike protein added to it, that this is not naturally found in nature, and you can see it when you compare the original with the new one that we're all suffering from. This is from Cambridge University, and this has been corroborated by others, but I'm bringing up Cambridge because it's Cambridge. Now, this is worrisome because this tells us that this virus did not leap from some animal to a human somewhere, or at least it did not originate in an animal. It actually originated in a laboratory. Tuck that away for now, but we may revisit that later. Now,
yeah, so you've got a prestigious university like Cambridge, maybe not on board, but suggesting against the rubric that this wasn't just made in some wet market in Wuhan.
That's exactly right. And this study doesn't elaborate on that in any way. The purpose of this study was to find out, how do we create a vaccine for this thing? So we must study this virus. But in studying the virus, they found this out and they published this information in the report. Not everyone has seen this, but you have to admit that that is something you have to keep in mind. Let's continue. Now, why are we doing these lockdowns? It looks to us like the virus numbers are a little bit exaggerated. We have the New York Times article that tells us the New York State lab has found that somewhere between maybe 43 and 90% of the positives are actually false positives. They're negative. We know the lockdowns have tremendously heavy side effects. A lot of people are suffering in many different ways. Why are we still locking down? We know from polls, a lot of Americans don't want the lockdowns, yet we're still doing it. Now, in episode 1, I hypothesized that this is actually a plan by some of the world financial elites to institute a change in our world, America and other countries as well, to change the way we work and the way we live. We call this the Great Reset. The Great Reset is a product of the minds of the founder and the executive chairman of what we call the group at Davos, of the World Economic Forum. This is a group that meets every year. It's the world elites. They get together and they discuss economic policy, economic plans going forward. These entities are usually heads of state. They're heads of corporations, banks. They're already in positions of power, and they stand to make more power from this move. You can go on Google, you can go on YouTube, you can go anywhere and read about this. It's been well publicized at this point. But what this group has said is that we want to use the opportunity that COVID-19 has presented, because it stopped our economy. We want to use this opportunity to change the economics of the US and of the world. And that economic change comes in the form of how we work, how we manufacture, how we eat, how we travel, how we really live. And in fact, I'm going to play a video for you from Klaus Schwab, Dr. Schwab. He's the head of the World Economic Forum. This is his brainchild. He created this idea. He's written books on it. The Fourth Industrial Revolution, the Great Reset. And I want you to see what he has to say here about the Great Reset.
The Fourth Industrial Revolution will impact our lives completely. It will not only change how we communicate, how we produce, how we consume. It will change actually us, our own identity, and of course gives life to such policies and developments like smart traffic, smart government, smart cities. What we will see is that everything will be integrated into an ecosystem driven by big data and driven particularly by close cooperation also of governments with business, civil society. And this revolution will come at a breathtaking speed. It will be like a tsunami. And actually, it's not just a digital revolution. It's digital, of course physical, with nanotechnology, but it's also biological. And so 3D provides a particular force to this revolution. So what the World Economic Forum is doing is to promote this public-private cooperation to master the fourth industrial revolution.
So we see here that Dr. Klaus Schwab is telling us that really everything is going to change. Now, this might be a good thing for some people. It might not. We don't really know. This is in the future, potentially. But we do know one thing, and this is what Dr. Schwab said himself. Half of the jobs in America will be lost from this. Half of the jobs. That's a tremendous economic hit. Now, Dr. Schwab maintains in his speeches and in his writings that if Americans and the rest of the world are able to reskill and upskill, meaning your job is going to be lost, you may be replaced by some sort of technological innovation, especially for those in manufacturing, those that work in, let's say, clerical jobs, potentially transportation jobs, etc. Multiple sectors are going to be affected by this. But what he says is we're going to lose half of our jobs. He says we have to find new jobs, and I'm a little bit concerned that that may be difficult to do. It's not so easy to just jump into a new industry with new skills and pick up where you left off, paying your mortgage, etc., etc. As I mentioned in episode 1, this seems like fantasy, pie in the sky, and it sounds like him promising us that this is going to happen may simply be an attempt to get us on board to do it, because a lot of people are skeptical that this is actually going to happen. Now, a lot of people would resist something like this. A lot of people would tell him, I'm not interested. Keep your innovation to yourself. It sounds like what you're saying is not good for my country. No, thank you. I'm not interested. That brings us to something we discussed in episode 1, which was a book that is called The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. Now, she wrote this book maybe 15, 18 years ago, and in it she outlined in the last 40, 50 years a number of instances in which large, powerful actors with power and money to be gained used disasters or some sort of chaos as a distraction or an excuse to implement changes in that country, that region, that society that the people that live there wouldn't ever really accept. But because of the disaster or the crisis, they were really not in a place to defend themselves. They're really fighting for their life or fighting for their homes or their finances or what have you. And unfortunately, they were not able to defend against these moves by the wealthy and the powerful that implemented these things in order to make more money and to get more power. And this took place in Iraq, Chile, the former Soviet Union, in Russia. It happened in New Orleans, here in the US. And this is really a well-documented phenomenon of the powerful and the wealthy around the world, including, for the most part, Americans. A lot of the wealthy and the powerful have really used these methods. And because of this information that Naomi has put out, showing us how a lot of these actors in the world use chaos, they use disaster to get what they want, a lot of people have been worried that this is exactly what the guys from the World Economic Forum, who are in league with the United Nations, the World Bank, the essentially all of the big actors that attend these Davos gatherings.
And I know this is just the latest iteration. They've been trying to do something like this for a while. It just, the coronavirus is kind of a new packaging.
Thank
for
you.
it. And I know when you look at and you see some of the people that attend these gatherings, it's just some of the biggest corporations. You know, Google's on there. I believe
Yes.
Goldman Sachs is on there.
Yes.
Coca-Cola, Pepsi.
Yes.
I mean, not exactly run-of-the-mill working class people attending these things.
No. In fact, to your point, Dr. Schwab, in the earlier days, he's done this for 50 years, like Brandon Ford just said. And in the early days, he limited the attendance to this thing to the 1,000 most influential people in the world. So we're talking about the world elites, the 1% of the 1% of the 1%. They're making these decisions together. I'm not there, you're not there. They're there without us. And in fact, he even actually doesn't always release the list of people that attend these things. And you can imagine why. It's a little bit suspicious, or not suspicious, it's a little bit concerning when you know that decisions are being made by the ultra powerful and rich of the world. And what kind of decisions do they make? Decisions that get them more riches and more power. And where does that come from? It comes from us. So that's why people have been worried. I'm worried about this. I'm skeptical that this is actually a good thing for us. I'm skeptical that our government is making the right moves with this lockdown. And in fact, they're using the lockdown, I think, to kill our economy, because President Trump in 2018 and 2019 essentially told the United Nations Assembly and the World Economic Forum, I don't think this is appropriate for America, and we're not going to be supporting this move to initiate the fourth industrial revolution in America. As Brandon just said, Dr. Schwab has been planning on doing something like this for many years, decades. It's his baby, right? This is his brainchild. He loves this stuff. It's his personal passion. He went to school for this stuff. He's been doing this for many years. He's 82 years old now, and he wants this to be the crowning achievement of his life. Now, the book, The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, discusses what we call disaster capitalism. All right, that's sort of the subtitle of the book, Disaster Capitalism. And she calls it that because, again, these groups use disaster as an opportunity to implement measures that get them money and power that the people that live in these areas would never tolerate if they were able to resist them. So they move in when they're weakest, most vulnerable, in order to exploit them. And this strategy, what we call the shock doctrine or disaster capitalism, was created by Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was a very well-known free market economist. He was essentially a proponent of free market business, of capitalism. He was well known around the world for it, and he was the father of what we call disaster capitalism. He was the one that helped implement this in Chile and other areas around the world. And this is something that he said about a crisis. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions taken depends on the ideas that are laying around. That, I believe, is our basic function: to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes inevitable. I'll repeat that. Keep these policies alive and available until the politically impossible becomes inevitable. How long has Dr. Schwab been working on this? About 50 years. That brings us to Event 201. On the 18th of October, the Center for Health Security at Johns Hopkins University, Maryland, conducted a pandemic response exercise in which they practiced what they would do if a pandemic broke out, and they did it with representatives from 2 other teams, and they met to drill this scenario. Now, this is their description of what this pandemic response exercise was about. Again, this is the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, and they said Event 201 was a 3.5-hour pandemic tabletop exercise that simulated a series of dramatic scenario-based discussions confronting difficult, true-to-life dilemmas associated with response to a hypothetical but scientifically plausible pandemic. Okay, so this is actually the 4th time the Center for Health Security has held an exercise like this. They did this in 2001 and 2004, and those were based on bio-warfare attacks. They did it again in 2018, and then again last year in 2019. Those were based on a pandemic, and that was the scenario that they drilled. Okay. What makes 2019, October 18th, this last year that they did this, what makes this so interesting is that the 2 teams that Johns Hopkins University teamed up with and partnered with come from 2 groups that we're particularly familiar with. And those groups are the World Economic Forum at Davos and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I'll repeat that. The 2 groups that drilled this pandemic response in 2019 were the World Economic Forum, the group at Davos that's associated with Dr. Schwab, the group pushing for this change in our world that a lot of people don't want, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Of course, Bill Gates is well known for his vaccine, being a proponent of vaccines, providing vaccines, and so on. On November 17th, 30 days after this tabletop exercise, this drill was held, the Chinese government recorded its first case of COVID-19. Let's let this sink in. These pandemic exercises do not take place very frequently. There was one in 2001, one in 2005, that was about biowarfare, 2018, 2019. They don't do this all the time. In the first 3 years that they did this, 01, 05, and 18, the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation were nowhere to be found. 2019, the World Economic Forum, Bill Gates are involved. 30 days later, the virus surfaces in China. 5 months after they held this exercise, on April 13th, Bill Gates announced that the response to COVID-19 would be a vaccine, would have to be a vaccine. And it would take 18 months of shutdowns of the economy before it would be ready. 2 months later, on June 5th, Dr. Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum announced that, quote, "The pandemic represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world." What he said was that due to the ravages of COVID-19, the world was ready for the Great Reset, his life's work. The plan agreed by the whole group at Davos, this group of the world's elites. Elite in power, elite in money, and what are they always gathering in order to plan, in order to get more power and more money? The word coincidence does not do this justice. This is what we call circumstantial evidence. Now, after they held their exercise, naturally they had some recommendations in case a pandemic would break out, which did happen 30 days later. They made 7 recommendations. I'm going to read you the 7th recommendation. Now, I looked through the previous 3 years that the Johns Hopkins Center did this. 2001, 2004, 2018. The recommendations that were published after these pandemic exercises always were always health measures, how to protect people. When the World Economic Forum and Bill Gates did this in 2019, their recommendations included things like how businesses should respond, how big businesses should respond to protect themselves from the lockdowns. Now, recommendation number 7. I'm going to read this. Quote, "Governments and the private sector should assign a greater priority to developing methods to combat mis- and disinformation prior to the next pandemic response. Governments will need to partner with traditional and social media companies to research and develop nimble approaches to countering misinformation." They go on. "Trusted, influential private sector employers should create the capacity to readily and reliably augment," that means change, "public messaging to manage rumors and misinformation." They finish with, "For their part, media companies should commit to ensuring that authoritative messages are prioritized and that false messages are suppressed, including through the use of technology," end quote. This recommendation was written before COVID-19 ever emerged, before there was any disagreement about where COVID-19 came from and how we should respond. Nothing like this was ever included in the 2001 recommendations, the 2004 or the 2018 recommendations, but they were included when the World Economic Forum and Bill Gates got involved. Why was there skepticism, or why did they anticipate skepticism about the virus from the public? Ask yourself that question. Why did the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation anticipate that if there was a virus to break out in a pandemic, that people would question what was going on?
It's a very strange response to prepare for, and it's almost like a ministry of truth they're trying to set up.
That's exactly what that sounds like. Where have we heard Ministry of Truth from, Mr. Ford?
Oh, that's very Orwellian. 1984.
1984. What was 1984, the book about?
It was about authoritative government and them deciding for you what's fit for consumption and what's not. It's sort of like the end of individuality.
What's fit for consumption and what's not. The end of individuality. These are the themes of the writings of Dr. Klaus Schwab.
Yeah, maybe you want to go over for the audience some of the tenets that they had in their commercial that they've since taken down since this has gotten a lot of attention.
Well, one of the primary tenets that the World Economic Forum has freely and openly pushed until they got blowback was that our world is going to change so much that even we will change. Our identities will change. And one of the slogans that they used until very, very recently, because people got worried when they saw the slogan, was, "I own nothing and I've never been happier." I'll repeat that. One of the slogans of the World Economic Forum to promote this great reset that they say is going to be so good for the world is, quote, "I own nothing and I've never been happier," end quote. That doesn't make any sense. That sounds like propaganda. Propaganda is information that the powerful put out to convince the less powerful to go along with their plans. That's propaganda.
And there are certain phrases that Klaus Schwab uses that you see world leaders, several of them use. One of them is "build back better." You'll hear Justin Trudeau use that in Canada.
Yes.
You'll hear Joe Biden use that. You'll hear quite a few other world leaders use that, almost like they're all reading from the same playbook.
Almost like they're all reading from the same playbook. Almost like they all went to Davos and found out what the plan is. So we need some solutions here, because anybody who's willing to give this an honest look has to admit this is worrisome. Anyone who says that this is not worrisome is either not considering it or is lying to you. This is important. We have to figure out a solution to this. So the first thing we all need to do is we need to call our governors, and we need to call them daily. This is important. This is a bad time for our country. Call your governor. Leave a 30 to 60 second voicemail every day. Tell your governor that if they continue to push these lockdowns, they will not be reelected. Our elected officials are there to make our lives better, not worse. If our governors and leaders cannot do that, they must be removed. This isn't complicated. This is how the world works. This is how leadership in America works. Our leaders represent us. They do not rule us. And we have to remind them of that. Number two, because they don't want to investigate the virus, because we see that their numbers are inflated, because they won't let us use medicines other than the vaccine that they're pushing, that we have to wait for, and we have to endure these lockdowns while we wait for them, very convenient for them. Because they want us to stay in our homes, because they want to kill our small businesses. And then what follows is the list of all the side effects that we opened up with. We need to take action. What is that action? We need to exercise civil disobedience. Civil disobedience means we all get together, the civilians of our country, and we tell our leaders, no more. You're not our leader anymore. We refuse. When re-election comes up, you will not be re-elected. We're going to elect somebody that looks out for our interests. That's how you solve problems like this. On YouTube, there's a great channel called Academy of Ideas. I love this guy. I don't know his name. He just recently put out a video on civil disobedience. I'm going to read you a quote because I can't say it better than he did. Quote, "Under the oppressive conditions of the all-powerful centralized state, disobedience takes a heroic act of the will, as stepping out of line can easily be paid for with one's life." Again, he says, under the conditions of an all-powerful centralized state, disobedience is a heroic act. Disobedience, therefore, is not an antidote to full-blown tyranny. Disobedience, rather, is a preventative measure to tyranny. But to be effective at returning freedom to a society at risk of losing it, disobedience must endure widespread support. It must, in other words, take the form of civil disobedience. What he's saying here, and he's right, when a government has taken so much power and control over the people, being disobedient puts you at risk of your life. We see that in many other countries where they don't have the rights of our American Constitution. They don't have the protections of our legal system. Instead, they get plucked out of the population if they resist, and they get imprisoned or killed. Maybe their families as well. So he said, therefore, you cannot wait until a government has become tyrannical and taken away your rights, because if you wait too long, resistance by the few doesn't work anymore. Instead, what we need to do is band together as a society. That's where the power is. A coordinated group is a powerful group. Therefore, all of us, all Americans, need to stand up against this.
That's right. Their greatest threat is an electorate that is critically thinking and will question everything.
Yes. And if an electorate, if a group of citizens that don't question everything and don't protect themselves against the government and the abuses of that government, then we find ourselves in a situation that we found ourselves in 1776, the beginning of this country's founding. And the reason that happened was the fathers of our country found the control of the government that was over them, the English government, the British government. They found that control to be too abusive, and they decided they weren't going to put up with it anymore. We need to take a cue from our forefathers and realize that liberties do not last forever unless you make sure they last. And that only happens when the group of us, when the citizens of a country rise up and tell their government, you're not going to do this anymore. And when the group does that, they hold the power. Power in a country like ours is power by consent. We consent to give our elected leaders power. They don't have power. We have power. There are millions of us. There are very few of them. We need to remember that, and we need to know how to use that power in order to protect ourselves, our families, our loved ones, and the country that was given to us by those that came before us. Now, that still doesn't change the fact that we have a virus here. And that despite the fact that the numbers may be exaggerated, we still have a virus that can harm many, many people or even kill them. So we still have to take appropriate actions to protect ourselves. And that brings me back to Dr. Michael Mina, the doctor from Harvard who called this out and said, hey, we have a problem here. These tests are being calibrated too sensitively. And what Dr. Mina recommended was we need to start using rapid tests instead of the PCR tests. And we need to get rid of the lockdowns. And what he recommends instead of the PCR tests and the lockdowns is lift the lockdowns. Give people their freedom back. It's theirs to begin with. Governments cannot take your freedom, at least not in America. We have the Constitution. Instead, we need to distribute these rapid tests, which are very inexpensive. The PCR tests are probably 12 times more expensive than the rapid tests, maybe 7 times depending on the pricing. And instead, we need to be able to use these at home. And that way we can self-regulate. If I'm not feeling well, I'll take a test. If I'm positive, I'm going to stay home. Because I should, not because the government will tell me. The government can't do that in America. We saw that ruling in those court cases that I just mentioned. So that's his recommendation. And despite the fact that we've all been hearing that these rapid tests are less accurate than the PCR tests, the very facts do not bear that out. That's propaganda. Instead, what Dr. Minna says is that the rapid tests have 99% specificity and 99% sensitivity, which means if you're negative, 99 out of 100 times, it'll read as negative. And if you're positive, 99 out of 100, it'll tell you you're positive. They work way better than the PCR tests. And finally, oh, by the way, he said, if we did this for a month and we kept the most contagious people off the streets because they're using these tests, he said that that alone, within 1 month, would drive epidemics practically to zero. He's an epidemiologist at Harvard. I think he knows more than your governor does. And then finally, of course, for those of us over 65 years old, because that population, unfortunately, has been hit hard by COVID, and of course those with some sort of comorbidity or sickness, they have to be particularly cautious. But the rest of us need to go back to work. We have to remember that we have rights. We have to remember that we have rights. When the Pennsylvania court case about the illegal lockdowns was heard by the federal judge, William Stickman IV, and he ruled that the state-posed limits on gatherings violated the First Amendment, and the stay-at-home and business closing orders violated the Fourth Amendment, he stated this in his ruling. Quote, "The liberties protected by the Constitution are not fair-weather freedoms, in place when times are good, but able to be cast aside in times of trouble. There is no question that this country has faced and will face emergencies of every sort. But the solution to a national crisis can never be permitted to supersede the commitment to individual liberty that stands as the foundation of the American experiment. The Constitution cannot accept the concept of a new normal where the basic liberties of the people can be subordinated to open-ended emergency mitigation measures." Judge Stickman is saying here that regardless of what emergency, regardless of the size of the emergency, you cannot tell people that they cannot exercise their freedoms. Case closed. And what I want to finish with here is there are always going to be people out there that want power. And there are always going to be people that act badly and unkindly. Because of that, we also need to act in a way that is consistent and appropriate. Because those things will always be there. Therefore, we need to know how to handle those things. And the way you handle those things is by, first and foremost, maintaining a kind disposition to each other, but standing on your rights firmly. You don't have to be violent. You don't have to be obnoxious. You have to be confident and firm, and you need to band together. And that's how you beat something like this. We need to do this, people. Contact your state representatives. Contact your governor. Make sure your elected leaders know they will not be in office for very long if they keep this up. And if we do this the right way, this will be over sooner than they want it to be over. We need to. So I thank you guys for watching. Sort of a very sober episode, but this is an important time that we're in, And we need to handle ourselves correctly because this matters. This is crucial. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.
Now is the historical moment, the time, not only to fight severe virus, but to shape the system. We have to live up to the expectations which we have created, and we will do so.